Last week, I began speaking about the concept of a patriarch, or a founder of a nation, and also some of the ideas that are involved, the structure, what's involved in being an of. In other words, I had been speaking previously about Avraham Avinu and the different concepts which are involved in Avraham Avinu. And last week I had now begun to generalize into a structure. What is the general structure? What are the general ideas which are concerned with all the of us? This week what I'm going to do is continue and really finalize and specialize and go into more detail. What is an of really all about? In other words, our of us, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, if we do not look at their maisim specifically or in detail, but rather look at the general idea of what constitutes an of. What is the idea, what is the meaning of an of? This is what I want to go into now. And then eventually, of course, I'll return to the idea of course, Yitzchak, and continue into the others. As we continue, our understanding of history as the expression of the Mashiach, which is what I've been doing until now. Now, when we look at an of, we can best understand that in terms of analyzing the tafkidim, or the responsibilities, the obligations, the charges, the duties of an of. And when you think about it, basically it comes down to the fact that there are 4 tafkidim. In other words, all the of us have 4 different tasks, and their history, the stories about them, reflect basically these 4 tafkidim. Now, under each tafkid, we can look at 4 different areas. Or rather, under each tafkid, we can look on 4 different areas. First, we can understand what is the tafkid, the definition, what is the task itself, in a clear way. The second area which we want to investigate is how is the tafkid to be understood from the concept of a merkava, which we said was the essential idea of the others. The third idea is that each of has a different chelik in that tafkid. In other words, each of performed the tafkid in a certain way that perhaps was different than the other of us as respect to that particular task. There's a third area to examine the different ways that each of handled the different tafkidim. And the fourth area is that how is the successful conclusion of each of, what does that have to do with Klal Yisrael? How did that benefit the descendants of the Avos? Okay? So we've got 4 areas. We're going to look at each tafkid, each purpose, and there are 4. We're going to look at the concept of the tafkidim, how they are built, how they are founded in the concept of Merkava. The third idea is that each of's chelik in that tafkid, each of's singular, unique contribution in that task. And the fourth would be, how does this affect Klal Yisrael? In what way? This is what we're going to do in this year. Each of, as I said previously, had 4 tafkidim, 4 purposes. Let's begin understanding the tasks of the of. And as such, of course, when we understand all these ideas, all the tasks, and the different areas in those tasks, then you can look into the others in Chumash, of course, with a different eye. The first task or tafkid of each of was to procure the concept of a merkava. In other words, to make sure that they enter into an agreement with the Rebbeinu Shalom and they become the merkava. Okay, that's to initiate the stage, or the state, I should say. So therefore, the first tafkid is to procure the concept of merkava in the first place, to enter that state where they are a merkava. Now, the merkava, the term merkava, which is chariot, is synonymous in idea with the word or term Yisrael and the term Sakan. All of them mean that whoever is a merkava or whoever is Yisrael or whoever is a Masakin, means that they have the ability to influence the amount of Ha'ara and Hester of the Rebbeinu Shalom Nebriya. They have the ability or the power to determine how much of the presence of God is revealed in the universe and how much of the absence of God is revealed in the universe. Of course, the Rebbeinu Shalom is not controlled by the individual who has this power. He subjugates his amount of presence or absence according to the actions of the individual. In that sense, he voluntarily subjugates. That's the Rebbeinu Shalom. Therefore, that's the concept of Masakin, or the concept of Yisrael Umerkava, that these individuals have the power of actually influencing the amount of the Rebbeinu Shalom in the Bria, and therefore, of course, the repercussions of that, of course, is awesome in terms of the Bria itself, in terms of the proliferation of evil when God is more absent, and the proliferation of good things happening to the universe when God is present. Tremendous power at the hands of a Jew. Okay, therefore, the first task was to procure this concept. Therefore, we find that Avram initiated the concept. He was the first. He is the one who made this covenant with the Rebbeinu Shalom at the outset. That's a bris ben Absaram, and that's the idea of the bris milah. We find that Yitzchak maintained the covenant. He didn't initiate, but he maintained the covenant. In other words, he kept up the tasks of the Ovos in order to maintain the agreement that God has with the Ovos. However, even with Avram and Yitzchak, it's possible for both of them to lose the agreement. So therefore it took Yaakov to finalize the concept. When Yaakov observed all the tafkidim, then the Rebbeinu Shalom sealed the covenant with the Yidden, with Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and consequently, of course, to all their descendants. So, Avram is the initiator, Yitzchak is the maintainer, and Yaakov, of course, is the finalizer. And as a result, it now happens that the Jews, for all eternity, have this power, and of course, the Jews, as opposed to the other nations of the world, the Goyim, the Umas Olam, they do not have this power, having lost it. And that's a subject I will deal with after I finish the Ovos, the entire concept of Goy and Jew, and the entire structure of 6,000 years of history, how we understand it in the terms of Jewish history. That's a topic that I'll be dealing with later. In any case, now, where do we see this? We see this in when we say in Siddur, when we say Haidu, before Baruch Shama if you're Sfard, and after if you're Ashkenaz, we say it, Asher Koras es Avram, that he made a covenant with Avram, Ushvuaso li Yitzchak, and he maintained his oath, which is the covenant to Yitzchak, Vayamideo, and he finalized it, and he established it, Liyaakov, to Yaakov, Lechoik, for an everlasting statute, Israel, to Israel, and to their descendants, Bris Olam, an everlasting covenant. That's what that means. That sums up that tafkid. Avram initiated it, Yitzchak maintained it by maintaining the tafkidim of the Ov, and Yaakov, of course, finalized it. And we will see, when we talk about Yaakov, how mamish in the Chumash you could see that the Rebbeinu Shalom finalized the concept of the bris, which I'll show you then. Where it's mamish a remez in the posuk that the initiation, of course, is open. The bris ben Absaram, we see clearly in the Chumash, and the idea of milah. But the finality of it, you see merumas in the Torah, that in Yisrael the finality of the bris, of course, was achieved. Now, in terms of Klal Yisrael, this, of course, the power to influence the amount of ha'ora, or the shechina, and that shechina is really the ha'ora of the Rebbeinu Shalom, the amount of power to bring the shechina into the bria, or to remove the shechina from the bria, was given over to their descendants. This is the idea of the Ovos as a shirish. Each of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov was a shirish. What does that mean? That means that whenever they did an act, they could indent or impress a specific concept in their neshama. That neshama, which would be extremely great, would be parceled out, so to speak, and given to other individuals after them. That would be their descendants. As a result, all descendants who therefore have the neshama of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov as their shirish, right, would then have the similar qualities or the indents of the original Ovos. So therefore, there was a certain period of time, which we'll talk about later, where any person's act will actually leave an impression on his neshama. And if that neshama was divided and given to others, they would automatically, intuitively feel those characteristics which the original individual indented or impressed on that neshama. As such, that's called the generation of Shroshim. So therefore Avram was a Shurish, Yitzchak and Yaakov. In other words, they had the power to influence or actually change their neshamas. Therefore, that's number one. And their neshamas would be roots to other neshamas. And as such, other neshamas later would actually feel the imprint internally, intuitively, actually without any avodah at all, because they have the neshama of the Ovos. So therefore, the Ovos as the power of being a Shirish, therefore meant that every time they did something, their descendants would benefit. By the mere fact that the descendants would have the neshama of the Ovos in different halakim. Therefore, since the first tafkid was to procure the concept of covenant, agreement or bris, which means to procure the power of a masakin, and each of was involved in getting that tafkid, that purpose, they internalized it in their shirish by the fact that they were shroshim. They internalized it for all Klal Yisrael by the fact that they were shroshim. This is the first tafkid of the Ovos, the procurement of the concept of a masakin. All three of us were involved in that avodah, and the fact that they gave it all to Klal Yisrael from the fact that they were shroshim. What is the next tafkid? Well, this is the first concept, or the first tafkid. And that obviously, a lot of the stories in the Chumash, the Maisim, of course, are involved in the idea that Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov have to procure this concept of Masakin. What's the second tafkid? The second tafkid of each of is to promote the Rebbeinu Shalom, to promote the concept of Hashem as a melech or an adon, as a king or a master of the universe. In other words, to promote the concept that God is an absolute authority, absolute supreme authority, the master of the universe. The idea of Yichud Shli Tosai, that the Rebbeinu Shalom is unique in his ability to control everything, and nothing could withstand whatsoever the control of the Rebbeinu Shalom. That's a melech, that's an absolute king. This was the second tafkid, to promote that concept. Now, that tafkid itself is divided further, is subdivided in two tafkidim, two sub-tafkidim, two sub-purposes. The first is that the Ov themselves had the avodah to perceive the Rebbeinu Shalom, and the second is that they had to proclaim or publicize this concept. That's all in the idea of to promote the concept of Hashem as Melech. Now, in the idea of perception, each of had to work in seeing the Rebbeinu Shalom as a Melech. It wasn't automatic because Avram certainly had to work because Terach, who was his father, of course, believed in Avodah Zarah. But even Yitzchak and Yaakov had to work to understand this. It wasn't given over right away. What does that mean? All of us had to work to perceive the Rebbeinu Shalom, to understand the Rebbeinu Shalom as a Melech. And they did it by their own yediyah, by their own laboring, and therefore understanding the Rebbeinu Shalom. And in that way they engaged in philosophical inquiries and proofs to come to the understanding of the Rebbeinu Shalom. That's yediyah. And they also carried on the emunah, which was the transmission that the Rebbeinu Shalom is a Melech, by Shem Ve'ever. Because Shem Ve'ever was still around at that time, in that yeshiva, which we know. And therefore, what they were teaching, of course, is a transmission of the tradition, that doctrine, that God is King, which they, of course, received all the way back to Adam Rishon. So the others had Yediyah and Emunah. First they had Yediyah, because they worked out understanding through philosophical proofs, logical proofs that the Rebbeinu is a Melech, and the common way is that, of course, Avraham Avinu looked at the Bria, and he saw purpose and design in the Bria, therefore he understood. Chazal gave some understanding of some of his reasoning processes. But not only Avram, who did that, but also Yitzchak and Yaakov, and also, so they got a yediyah of the Rebbeinu Shalom. They also had to work on emunah in the sense that they listened to the transmission that was given by Shem Ve'ever, which went all the way back from Adam Rishon, that doctrine or tradition which was transmitted, and in the time of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, there was Shem Ve'ever. Now, where do we see that? We see that in the Shemona Esrei. Chazal say, or the Meforshim say, that it says in Shemona Esrei, Elokeinu v'lekei avosenu, the God who is the God of our fathers, the God Elokei Avram, Elokei Yitzchak v'Yaakov, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. Why does it say the God who is the God of our fathers? And then it says the God of Avram, God of Yitzchak and God of Yaakov. You already said that. We're saying the God of our fathers. And our fathers are Avram, Yitzchak and Yaakov. The answer to that is that each of knew the Rebbeinu Shalom or perceived them because of two directions. One was from the directions of Avosenu, meaning the Emunah, the historical transmission, which they got, Yitzchak and Yaakov got from Avram, and Yaakov from Yitzchak and Avram, of course, from Shem Ve'ev, and so on. But also, each one worked out his own Yediyah. So therefore, God was the God of their fathers, which is the historical transmission, that's the Emunah. And also, He was also individually the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Because each one labored to understand the Rebbeinu Shalom mitzvah his own Chakira and Meifus, mitzvah his own demonstrations into the universe to understand that the Rebbeinu Shalom is an Odin Melech. And that's what that's why it says twice in Shemona Esrei, to understand that the perception of the Rebbeinu Shalom has to come from two directions. Your own Yegiyah to verify the idea of the existence of the Rebbeinu Shalom, and then He's a Melech in the Bria, through reasoning, which is what they did, and it can be known, contrary to what Goyim think, and Aprikosim. And the second idea, of course, is to believe the transmission, the Emunah, that each one gets as a result of Shem Ve'eva, or because you get it from the Avos themselves, which was in the case of Yitzchak and Yaakov. Okay, that is the first task, subtask, under the general task of to promote the Rebbeinu Shalom as an Odoin, as a Melech. The second task was to proclaim or publicize this concept. And of course we find the Avos engaged in this, promoting, to publicize the Rebbeinu Shalom throughout the Bria as much as possible, but each one of course did it in their different ways, and they did it in different extents. Avram, of course, would seem to have done it the most, Avram Avinu, by making Gerim and going out and proclaiming throughout the world that the Rebbeinu Shalom is the Melech. Yitzchak and Yaakov would have done that, not to the extent of Avram, more so in their own being as a model. Because that's what Avimelech said to Yitzchak and so on, that I see that you're a man of God. How does he see that? Because through the righteousness of Yitzchak himself, he was able to perceive that, and so on. So therefore, each individual, of course, they proclaim that and publicize this to the people around them, and whoever would come in to listen and so on. But in any case, all the of us were involved, and most specifically Avram, in the tafkid of to publicize or to proclaim this concept. That is the concept of promoting the Rebbeinu Shalom. Either first is to perceive, and second is to proclaim. That is the general tafkid. Now, in terms of its base of a Merkava, we understand, because what's the idea of a Merkava? To bring the Rebbeinu Shalom, who is the driver, to the world, to the Olam, in other words, to all creation. In other words, to bring the concept of his Malchusai, which was hidden, to bring it to all creation. So that's the Merkava. The Merkava, when we say that Chazal and the Merkava, the idea of a Merkava is to bring the driver to the destination, which means to bring the Hasaga of the Malchus of the Rebbeinu Shalom to creation. Therefore, the Merkava automatically indicates that one of their tafkidim is automatically going to be to promote the Rebbeinu Shalom as an Odoin or Melech on the Bria. It's attached. So this, of course, is the second tafkid. Now, in terms of the how it happens to, how it influences Klal Yisrael, it influences Klal Yisrael in interesting ways. How do we feel this? This fact that the Avos indented, or they impressed upon the Neshama this Yegiyah, this effort to perceive God and proclaim it. This has its implications in the Neshama in terms of what's called in Yiddish Pintele Yid. There's a certain concept called Pintele Yid, which means that if you walk over to a Jew who's fry, and you begin talking about religion or whatever, religion, God, Judaism, whatever, you're going to awaken something internally that lies in his soul. You awaken it. That's called a Pintele Yid. That point, even though it seems that he's gone from Yiddishkeit, and he's fried, he's Machal Shabbos and so on, and there's no belief in God and so on. However, every Jew, because they have one of the shroshim of the Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, automatically has a desire internally to perceive, to know the Rebbeinu Shalom, and to become close to him, to become Dovek in the Rebbeinu Shalom, automatically. And all you have to do is come out to a Jew and tap it in some fashion. You have to look for the point of entrance, and that's not always an easy task. But if you find the point of entrance, the Jew is mis'ura automatically to begin thinking and searching for the Rebbeinu Shalom. This is the idea of Pinto Yid that actually becomes part of their descendants. In other words, that Jews have the desire internally to seek God, which means to perceive the Rebbeinu Shalom, to know him, and to get close to him. Jews have that internal desire, and that's why you find Jews are so often part of these cultist movements. What are they doing there? They're out of all proportion to their numbers, because Jews are tremendous seekers. Internally, in their neshama, they search for the Rebbeinu Shalom. So therefore, they'll seek. And that explains why. Because the Pintel Yid always forces the Jew. That shiur of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov forces the Jew to seek meaning, seek God. But unfortunately, he many times goes astray because the Yetzer Hara, Sitra Achra, tries to show him other directions and so on. But that desire to seek, and why the Jew is always out of proportion to his number in all these crazy cults and Eastern religions and Buddhists and so on, that is why you have that as a result of this concept called Pintel Yid. Now, the Gemara also says Ma'aminim ubnei Ma'aminim, which is the same idea, that Jews are Ma'aminim, they believe in God, and they also are Bnei Ma'aminim, they are descendants of those who believed in God. And who are those? The others. Why does the Gemara say Ma'aminim ubnei Ma'aminim? Because the reason why Jews are Ma'aminim is because they have it indented in their souls from the Ma'aminim that they are descendants of. In other words, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov has given the power or the urge, the search, the intuitive desire to seek the Rebbeinu Shalom. Put it in their neshamas because they sought the Rebbeinu Shalom through Yediyah and Emunah, therefore that's embedded in their neshama. So every Jew has that Pintel Yid, to seek God, to perceive the Rebbeinu Shalom, and to get close to him. And all you have to do is get to the right entrance, and you've got it. Now, that's in terms of the idea of perceiving God. In terms of publicizing the Rebbeinu Shalom, again, all Jews have that. Jews have a very strong social instinct. They stay together very much. They interact with other Jews, and you always find Jews trying to impress their views on other Jews. That's classic. Where does that come? That's the desire of the Jews to publicize, to impress upon others, especially other Jews, what they believe in themselves. This is the idea of Jews. Jews always are telling what they think. They always have a day about something. Then that comes from the fact that Jews have it in their nature to proclaim what they believe, to tell it to other Jews. Unfortunately, sometimes it's wrong, and they try to proclaim and tell it to other Jews. But that nature, the desire to tell other Jews, not only other Jews, that desire to tell even Goyim about what they believe, that comes strongly from the Avos, which proclaimed the Rebbeinu Shalom throughout the Bria, because they were involved in proclaiming, publicizing, telling the other people the truth. So Jews are always caught up in proclaiming the truth to others. They're always at the head of activists and these kind of the activists and so on. People who are always trying to opt for change in that sense, or to proclaim truth. So political movements and so on. Jews always have political movements and so on, because Jews have a desire to proclaim what they feel is true. Unfortunately, sometimes what they feel is true, of course, is wrong, so it's also bad in a certain sense. But that desire to proclaim comes from the second sub-tafkid, which is to proclaim the truth, which is part of the tafkid of to promote the Rebbeinu Shalom altogether. Therefore, we see that the Jews therefore inherited from both sides the perception, which is that Pintel Yid, and also the idea of the proclaiming the Rebbeinu Shalom, which gives them that strong instinct to interact or to impress other Jews and even Goyim. Now, this is the idea of so far of the second tafkid. Now, what I want to mention is that, again, is that when I talk about the Ovis, as a result of the Ovis work, the avoid of the Ovis, that they were able to give it to their Klal Yisrael, I mean as a national trait, that Jews as a national people, as a people, have this trait. I'm not talking about specific individuals, but Jews as a nation unto themselves, a national trait or characteristic, have this as a result of the avoid of the Ovis. Now, one more thing. Each of, even though he perceived the Rebbeinu Shalom as a result of his own Yigiyah, his Yediyah, and his Emunah, and also he publicized this concept, right? And we see also how it part of the Merkava, and also how the Jews inherited these qualities in their own neshama. It's important to note that each of the others perceived the Rebbeinu Shalom in the same way, but each one had a strong emphasis in the way he perceived the Rebbeinu Shalom. Avram perceived very clearly and very strongly the chesed of the Rebbeinu Shalom to a tremendous degree. He was tremendously in tune with the idea that the Rebbeinu Shalom is a murdi bal chesed. In other words, he perceived that quality of the Rebbeinu Shalom in an extremely strong degree. Of course, he perceived the Rebbeinu Shalom in all the other areas as well, but this is what really made a roshim in his neshama in that sense. Therefore, of course, he was involved to an incredible extent in being a Baal Chesed, which I'll talk to a little later in terms of the other tafkidim of the others. Now, Yitzchak perceived the Rebbeinu Shalom in terms of his gevura, his incredible strength, his ability to control and to regulate the Bria, and to be exact in justice. That's what Yitzchak perceived, this gevura, this awesome strength of the Rebbeinu Shalom. Therefore, Yitzchak, of course, personified the gevura of the Rebbeinu Shalom most intensely. Of course, Yitzchak perceived the other things also, but for some reason, this hit him the most. And of course, Yaakov perceived the truth of the Rebbeinu Shalom most strongly. In other words, the idea of Torah, which is truth, he perceived the idea that the Rebbeinu Shalom has an incredible amount of that. The right combinations that must be had in terms of one's midas, how it's given, he perceived that. In other words, there's both chesed and din or gvura in the universe, in different measures. That's the idea of emes. He perceived truth means that he perceived that the Rebbeinu Shalom acts in accordance with truth, which is really chesed and gvura. Therefore, Yaakov perceived that mostly, and therefore as a result of that, the fact that they perceived these traits of the Rebbeinu Shalom more acutely, they therefore proclaimed this perception most strongly to others. Avram proclaimed the chesed, Yitzchak the gvura, and Yaakov the emes most strongly because they perceived especially these characteristics of the Rebbeinu Shalom in the Bria. I'll talk about this a little more when we talk about the next tafkid of the Ovis. So therefore, that's the second tafkid of the Ovis. The idea, the promoting the concept of the Rebbeinu Shalom as a Melech and Odin, that these basically are subdivided into two ideas: to perceive the Rebbeinu Shalom and to proclaim this concept. Also, that these ideas are rooted in the Merkava, and that each of has a different chelik in this perception and proclamation, publicizing, and also what the inheritance of we as Jews means as a result of their avodah, and the fact that they are shirish, and therefore they can give this over to their descendants. Now, the next tafkid is the idea that the Ovis spent a tremendous yegiyah, labor, in taking the will of God, to take Hashem's will, and to make it their own. This is what they did. The next tafkid is to reflect the will of God, to reflect it in terms of one's own will. In other words, to take the will of God and to make it the content of one's own will. So where your will coincides with the will of the Rebbeinu Shalom. In other words, that they would adopt Hashem's will as their own, of course, through Bechira, through free choice, free will. This is what the next tafkid of the Ovis was. And of course, that would also mean that they would adhere to his will in a very strong fashion. This was the next tafkid of the Ovis. Now, This also is subdivided into two ideas. To adapt the Rebbeinu Shem's will as one's own is basically divided into two ideas. One is to adapt the Rebbeinu Shem's characteristics or his attributes and assume them as one's own. Because if a person is a Baal Chesed, obviously he wants to be. His will is to be a Baal Chesed. If God is a Baal Chesed, it means that his will is that he wants to be Meitiv or be a Baal Chesed. Therefore, the Rebbeinu Shem's characteristics or his attributes are nothing more, of course, than a response to his will. Therefore, if the others want to adapt his will, then they would also adapt his characteristics. Now, if you remember what I said previously, that the attributes of God is merely his guise, his projected personality, but bi'atzmusoi, we do not know who and what he is. But in terms of his personality as he presents himself to the Bria, he has specific traits, specific characteristics. And that is his will. Therefore, the others who adapt that, of course, they adapt those characteristics. In other words, the others would imitate or they would emulate, they would personify those characteristics of the Rebbeinu Shalom. This is the first subheading under the idea of to adapt the Rebbeinu Shalom's will as one's own. The second idea, the second heading, or the division of adapting the Rebbeinu Shalom's will as one's own, is that every of adopted the Taryag mitzvahs. Because it is the will of the Rebbeinu Shalom at that point in time that these mitzvahs should be observed by man, even though he didn't command man, but it is his will that they should be observed by man. Therefore, they who are very sensitive to what the will of the Rebbeinu Shalom, they adopted those Taryag mitzvahs. And included in that is the fact that they were moiseh nefesh. They would give their lives in order to make sure that they would continue observing those Taryag mitzvahs. And we see the fact that of course, Avram and Yaakov, we see clearly adopted the Taryag mitzvahs, because by Avram it says that the Rebbeinu Shalom says that Avram observed my Teres, my Mishpotim, my Mitzvot, and so on. The Rebbeinu Shalom says that in Bereshis. And by Yaakov it says, Im Loven Garti, I lived with Loven. So Chazal say that Garti is the same oisius as Taryag, which means I lived with Loven and I observed the 630 mitzvahs, which shows us, of course, that Yaakov was observing 630 mitzvahs. Now, of course, if Avram and Yaakov were doing it, of course, Yitzchak was certainly doing it. So therefore, the others were adopting the will of God as their own, not only in terms of the characteristics that they would assume, that they would emulate or personify, but also in the sense that they adopted the Taryag mitzvahs, which is the will of God that these things should be observed by man. And also, they were moiseh nefesh. That's how strong they wanted to observe these Taryag mitzvahs. And you see the Mesiras Nefesh, of course, by the others, by the kivshin or eish that they threw Avram in the fire. Nimrod had him thrown into the fire. If he wouldn't give up his beliefs and so on, of course, and Avram allowed himself to be thrown into the fire, which is Mesiras Nefesh for the Rebbeinu Shalom, to his will, to adopt his will, and not give up the emunah. And the second thing is by the Akedah, that Yitzchak, of course, gave up his life, was willing to give up his wife for the will of the Rebbeinu Shalom. If that is what God wants, if that's his will, his tzivoy, his commandment, then he is willing. Of course, that has repercussions in terms of Jews, which I'll get into, all these ideas. The ideas of the fact that they adopt his characteristics, the idea of the fact that they observe the Taryag mitzvahs, and the idea that they're moiseh nefesh for those Taryag mitzvahs, those will have profound implications in the internal soul of Klal Yisrael, and they therefore have intuitive feelings in that direction, which I'll get into. In any case, this is the third tafkid of the Oros, is to adapt the will of the Rebbeinu Shalom, and that is subdivided in the sense of to adapt his will and therefore assume the same characteristics or attributes as the Rebbeinu Shalom, to personify them. And the second idea is to adapt the will of the Rebbeinu Shalom by adapting the Taryag mitzvahs and to be moiseh nefesh for those Taryag mitzvahs. Now, the connection to the Merkava, of course, is that the Merkava can only bring the driver to his destination if the Merkava does not have a will of its own. If somebody's sitting on horses, and the horses who have a will of their own decide not to do with the driver is going to wind up in someplace else other than the destination he wants, because the horses are embodying their own will. They're doing what they want to do. So therefore, in order for the horses to bring a driver to his destination, they have to accede to the will of the driver and make that their own will. The chariot, of course, is an inanimate object that has no will of its own, but the idea is that the others have to become like a chariot where they resemble an inanimate object, that their will is mamish the will of the Rebbeinu Shalom. Even though they adopt this will, of course, through free will, bechira, but in essence, they are adopting the will of the Rebbeinu Shalom. And that's what the chariot is. The chariot indicates not only the purpose of the chariot, but also the way of getting to that purpose, and that is to become a chariot, to adopt the will of its driver, to become an inanimate chariot, which in the case of a human being means, since he does have a will, and he's animate, is to adopt the will of the Rebbeinu Shalom, to make that the content of your will. So therefore, that's how the third tafkid flows from the principle or the symbolism of the chariot. Now, what's also important to understand is that, now in terms of how each of observed these mitzvahs, or how each of observed this, we see that each of adopted a different midah of the Rebbeinu Shalom, a different attribute. That what the others, they emulated, in other words, each one emulated the Rebbeinu Shalom in a different respect. Avraham emulated the Rebbeinu Shalom most strongly in chesed, Yitzchak most strongly in the attribute of gvura, strength or din, and Yaakov in the attribute of emes, the desire for, tremendous desire for truth. So we see that each of emulated the Rebbeinu Shalom because each one was adopting the will of the Rebbeinu Shalom, but each of took on a midah, a specialty in a midah. Of course, Avraham was also gvura and emes, and Yitzchak was also chesed and emes, and Yaakov was also chesed and gvura. But the specialty of each of course, was that midah. And one of the reasons why they adopted that specific midah so strongly is because each of came from a different source in terms of the spheres of the Rebbeinu Shalom, and that I'll talk about probably next week. In the sense that the aspect of the chesed, how chesed emanates from the Rebbeinu Shalom, Avraham emanated from that aspect. Therefore, he was more attuned to the chesed. He perceived and personified it. Yitzchak was more attuned to the gvura, that sphere which deals with gvura. Therefore, his shirish came from that side. Therefore, he was, of course, attuned to gvura. And Yaakov was tiferes, which is that aspect of truth of the Rebbeinu Shalom. Therefore, that's where his shirish was. Therefore, he was more attuned to adopting, of course, emes or tiferes, which I'll talk about probably next week. Now, therefore, each of course, emulated or personified the Rebbeinu Shalom in all respects, but most strongly in one midah, because they perceived the most strongly that way, and more importantly, because each one's shirish came from one of those particular spheres, which is the source of the attribute of the Rebbeinu Shalom himself. Now, this is the idea of the us adopting the will of God in terms of their characteristics. Now, besides the fact that each one, as I said, emulated, each one, of course, observed the Taryag mitzvahs, as I pointed out. That was each one's chelik. And each one, of course, was Moshe Nefesh for the Taryag mitzvahs. As I pointed out, Avraham in the Kivshan, and Yitzchak, of course, in the Akedah, and even Yaakov by Lavan, were actually to observe the Taryag mitzvahs was actually rather a sakonistic profession. In any case, but there you had the Mesiras Nefesh of each of, the observance of the mitzvahs of each of, and you had the emulation of each of in all the midas, but specifically in one midah. So therefore we see what the tafkid is, right? What the tafkidim are. We see how it emerges from the metaphor of the chariot, the Merkava, and we see how each of they observed this tafkid and how each one specialized. Now, how do we see this in Klal Yisrael? What did they leave us as a Yerusha from the fact that they are a shirish and therefore they can indent or impress upon the neshama, and we will have a chelik of that neshama, of course, because they are our roots or shirish. How do we see it in terms of ourselves? Well, in very interesting ways. First of all, in the fact that the others observed the Taryag mitzvahs, right, and there was a tremendous ava in observing the Taryag mitzvahs. When the Jews came to accepting the Taryag mitzvahs, what was it? Nasa v'nishma. It was really relatively much easier for them because they had a desire to accept the Taryag mitzvahs. which means they had a desire intuitively to accept the Oil Malchus Shemayim, the yoke of heaven. And this, of course, was given by the Avos. In other words, that the Yidden are much more readily, it's easy for them to accept the will of God, to accept the kingdom of heaven upon themselves, which is a Taryag Mitzvah. And you see that, like I say, by Matan Torah, when not only did they accept it by saying Naaseh v'nishma, but Naaseh v'nishma came first, which is a qualitative or superlative form of acceptance, where they said, we will do because you said so, we're maminim, and then we will understand. Then we'll try to understand. So not only did they accept it readily, but they accepted it in an incredible way. Whereas, if you recall, the Goyim, every one of them rejected it when it was offered at the time of Matan Torah, which I had mentioned previously. So therefore, the aspect, the tafkid which the Avos did in terms of accepting God were readily given over to make it easy for the Jews to accept the Torah, even though they had gotten out of so many hundreds of years of slavery and already listening to the will of some other master, right? So you think that these people would want to be free by now. Adrabah. They accepted the Torah, they traded one yoke for another yoke, and they recognized what the yoke of the Rebbeinu was, and therefore they readily accepted it because of the avoid of the others. Now, that's in terms of accepting it. Now, in terms of adhering strongly to this will, Chazal say, interestingly enough, that if Klal Yisrael, if im einam neviim b'nei neviim, if they are not prophets, then they are sons of prophets. What does that mean? It means that if they are not prophets because their maisim do not allow them to be a prophet, means they have not worked for the stage of prophecy, they are automatically sons of prophets, which means the Avos, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, who are Nevi'im, that they are sons in the sense that they automatically, intuitively have the characteristics of a prophet. And you know what that is? That they intuitively know the Ratzon Hashem. Jews have an intuitive feel of what the will of God is, even if it's not necessarily told them. That's the idea of, if they are not Nevi'im by virtue of their own Maisim, they are intuitive Nevi'im. They are intuitively aware of what God wants. And this is brought out beautifully by the story in the Gemara where Hillel, where they asked Hillel, they said, what happens if somebody forgot to bring a knife on Pesach to shech the Korban Pesach, and Pesach happened to be on Shabbos? So we know that Pesach is Derech Shabbos. In other words, if Pesach comes out on Shabbos, you can shech the Korban Pesach on Shabbos. It's Derech Shabbos. It suspends the laws of Shabbos. What happens if you forgot to bring the knife? Since you could have brought the knife yesterday, then bringing the knife itself does not suspend Shabbos. So what's the halacha? So Hillel told them, I forgot. But he said, if the Jews are not Nevi'im, they are B'nai Nevi'im. That's where the statement comes from. Let us see tomorrow what they do. What did they do? So it says the Jews, they took their knives. They saw the Jews on the Mamash in Pesach, and it was Erev Pesach or Shabbos. So they looked, they watched, and they saw that the Jews, and nobody told them this, that the Jews, they took the knife, and if you brought a Korban Pesach, it was a goat, so they stuck it in its horns. And if they brought a Korban Pesach, it was a sheep, they stuck it in its wool. And that way, so really you're not allowed to carry it, but they allowed the animal to carry it for them. And even though a person is Mitzuvi, he's commanded on Shvisas Behemte, which means that he cannot allow his animal to do work, but this is Shaloi Kederach. I mean, it's not the normal way for the animal to carry something in its horns and in its hair, and that Chazal permitted. And when Hillel saw that, it says he was Niska, Rov and Niska, he saw it and remembered the halacha from Shmai V'Avtalin. He said, I remember that Shmai V'Avtalin said that if you forgot to bring the knife, stick it in the horns of the goat and put it in the wool of the tzayin, which shows you that the Yidden intuitively knew what to do. That's what he said, if they're not Nevi'im, B'nai Nevi'im heim, they automatically, intuitively know the will of the Rebbeinu Shalom, because the Avos was so strong in not only accepting the will of God, but in adhering to the will of the Rebbeinu Shalom. Therefore, the Jews also have that quality. And so therefore we see that the Jews have the quality in accepting, that's Naaseh v'nishma, in adhering, im einam nevi'im, b'nei nevi'im heim, they can understand intuitively what the will of the Rebbeinu Shalom is, besides accepting it. What about the Mesiras Nefesh? And that comes, of course, from the Akedah of Yitzchak, and basically from the Kivshin of Avram, and also from Lovan in terms of Yaakov. And there we see Because Chazal say, very interestingly enough, that the Jews, that there are three kinds of people, entities which are murdik azus, very obstinate, very obdurate, a tremendous amkishi uref, a stiff-necked. He said the Jews among the nations are the most stiff-necked of all people. A dog among animals is the most stiff-necked among animals, and a rooster among birds. Rooster, very, very stubborn. Therefore, the meat of Azus comes from the Ovus, because they were very stiff-necked. They refused to give up their convictions about their belief in God, and they would rather go to the altar or to the fire or to be destroyed than give up the quality of Azus. Therefore, the meat of Azus, of course, comes from the Ovus. That quality of Azus is what enables the Jews to be Moser Nefesh for the Taryag mitzvahs. And therefore, the Jews, they emulate this from the shirish of the Ovus, and as a result of that, they also have this azus, this obstinacy, this stubbornness. That's why the Rebbe Shem calls themselves, you're a shiur, I'm a shiur. You're a stubborn, a stiff-necked people. And Adrabah, they got this from the Ovus because of their azus against not believing, or the temptations that they had not to believe in the Rebbe Shem, the Mesiras Nefesh. And like Chazal say, that the Jews are most stubborn among the nations, besides the other two, and therefore this quality of azus in Mesiras Nefesh for Taryag mitzvahs comes from the Ovus. I will have to continue the other midas, how the Jews inherited that from the Ovus, next week. Now, just to provide a brief review of last week, what we're doing now is going into the conceptual structure of an Ov. In other words, what are those ideas which generally create the concept of Ov? In other words, I'm not going into the Ovos themselves in terms of the Chumash and analyzing the incidents and the stories about them, but I'm really presenting the general idea of an Ov, and what does it mean to be an Ov, a patriarch, like Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. And last week I had mentioned that there are basically four elements to this idea. The idea of a tafkid, which is the task of the Ov. The second idea is the basis of that task in the metaphor of a Merkava. The third idea was that each Ov's chelik, or each Ov's contribution toward that, a fulfillment of that task. And the fourth, of course, is the idea that each Ov, of course, was a shirish, a root for Klal Yisrael, and as such somehow gave over an inheritance to Klal Yisrael, because each of us really partake of the neshamas of the Ovos. Now, I had mentioned that last week I had mentioned three. The first idea, the first tafkid, or task, is the idea that the Ovos had to procure the concept of Masakin, that they had to get this idea of a Masakin, which I explained previously. In other words, Avram initiated that concept, Yitzchak maintained that concept, and Yaakov finalized that concept. This was a contribution, of course, to each of toward the task of procuring the concept of Masakin. In addition, that which they bequeathed to Klal Yisrael, of course, was that all Yisrael, every Jew, can now be a Masakin, to remove the deficiency of Hester, which was created by the Rebbeinu Shalom, and also that deficiency which was created by man. The second task, which I had mentioned last week, is the idea that each Ov had to promote the Rebbeinu Shalom as a Melech, as an Adon, to promote God as King of the universe, as a Master of all. The idea of Yichud Shlitosoi. And I had mentioned that this is further subdivided into two different tasks. One is that they themselves had to perceive the Rebbeinu Shalom, and the second is that they had to proclaim this concept, to publicize the concept that the Rebbeinu Shalom is a Melech. These are the two tasks under the idea of promoting the Rebbeinu Shalom as a Melech. Now, I had mentioned also last week how this is based in the concept of a Merkava, and also that the contribution of each of course, in terms of what they proclaimed and therefore what they perceived in a special way, was the chesed of Avram, the kindness of Avram, the gvul or strength of Yitzchak, and the tiferes, the beauty of Yaakov. And I had mentioned that the repercussions in terms of their descendants is that in the first task, in terms of perceived Rebbeinu Shalom, we have the idea called Pinteliyid, which I explained last week. And the idea of proclaiming proclaiming the Ribbon Shalom and to publicize this, that idea, that which was left in terms of Klal Yisrael, is that Jews tend to be very idealistic. They tend to proclaim their ideals, and they generally have activist tendencies in terms of what they believe. The third idea, which I had mentioned, the third task of each of, was to adopt and to adhere to the Ribbon Shalom's will, to accept his will, to adopt it, and to strongly adhere to what God wants. And I had mentioned that this is further subdivided into two tasks. One is to adopt Taryag mitzvahs, because that's God's will, that people observe the 613 commandments. Therefore, this is what the Avos did. And the second is that the Avos were involved in personifying those attributes in themselves. That they themselves emulated these attributes of the Ribbon Shalom. And I had mentioned how both of these ideas, or rather the idea of adopting and adhering to the Ribbon Shalom's will, how this is based in the metaphor of Merkava. And that each of, in terms of what each of's contribution was, that each of observed the Taryag mitzvahs, and they were also Moshe Nefesh. They gave up their lives to observe the Taryag mitzvahs. And also, this is in terms of the Taryag mitzvahs, and also in terms of personifying the attributes, that each of took a specific midah. As I had mentioned, Chesed for Avram, Gevura for Yitzchak, and Teferes for Yaakov. Now, in terms of what the Avos gave over to Klal Yisrael as a national trait or national characteristic, I had mentioned last week that in the idea of Taryag mitzvahs, in terms of accepting the Taryag mitzvahs, this made it easy for the Jews to say Na'aseh v'nishma. In terms of adhering to the mitzvahs, which the Avos did, they adhered very strongly to these mitzvahs. This gave the Jews the ability to know the Ribbon Shalom's will. Therefore, that's what it means by Im Einam Neviim, B'nei Neviim Heim. If they are not prophets, they are the sons of prophets. In other words, they intuitively know the will of God. And in terms of the Avos adhering to the will of God, to the Taryag mitzvahs, and the fact that they gave up Mesiras Nefesh, Jews have a national trait of being azus. Jews are very stubborn, very obdurate. They're shiur, and they will rather let themselves be killed than give up or renounce that which they truly believe. This is the idea of azus in Jews, and that comes from the Mesiras Nefesh of the Av. This brings us to the end of the review, and I am now into the last idea, the last characteristic that the Avos gave to Klal Yisrael as a result of the personification of the attributes of God. In other words, that's where we're up to now. Now, we see that the third task was to adopt and to adhere to the will of the Ribbon Shalom, which means the Taryag mitzvahs. And I just mentioned now how this idea was communicated or given over, transmitted in terms of a national trait to Israel, to Jews. What about the second task, or the second subtask, of personifying the attributes of God, which we know each of did? That Avram did Chesed, Yitzchak did Gevura, strength, and Yaakov did Teferes, truth, and these ideas I'll explain later what these midas are. In any case, what was the national trait that the Jews took as a result of the fact that the Avos personified those midas, those attributes? What do we Jews today have as a result of that? And the answer to that is that the Gemara says there's an interesting Chazal that says that Klal Yisrael, Jews, have three different attributes. This is a fundamental nature of Jews. And it says that whoever has these midas should stick or cling to these people. What are the three midas that Chazal say that Klal Yisrael has? They're baishonim, means they're shameful. They have the trait of shamefulness. They are also rachmanim, they are compassionate, and they are gimli chasodim. They give a lot of acts of kindness, charity, or whatever. This is what Chazal say, that all Jews have those three attributes. And if we look closely, we can see that each one of these attributes really comes from one of. And again, we see that as a result of the fact that the Avos personified the attributes of God, which was the second subtask in the general task of adapting the Rebbeinu Shalom's will and making it as one's own. Therefore, they of course personify these attributes, which is the will of the Rebbeinu Shalom, since he has them also. Therefore, we find that these three attributes which Chazal say are really nothing more than the inheritance of that which the Avos gave to their descendants, Klal Yisrael. How do we see that? Well, let's take a look at Baishanim. What does Baishanim mean? A Baishan. Baishan means one who is shameful, humble, humility. In other words, there's no arrogance. One who's shameful, there's no arrogance, there's no conceit in that individual. When does a person become a Baishan, shameful? When a person understands truth. A person is very humble in the face of truth. It's when a person doesn't perceive true reality that he's very arrogant. But however, when a person perceives truth, he's humble. He's a Baishan. The midah of Yaakov was emes. Yaakov Avinu was a great pursuer of truth. And of course, part of that truth is knowing exactly where one stands in relationship to the Rebbeinu Shalom. Yaakov perceives himself in relation to the Rebbeinu Shalom as of course totally insignificant. And of course he summed it up when he was running away, when he was going to meet Esav. He said himself in that prayer, Kotointi mikol hachasodim, that on the contrary, I am very small in terms of, in other words, I don't deserve all the chasodim that you've given me. That's a baishan. That's shameful. That's an individual who's very humble, very embarrassed or shameful in terms of taking chasodim from the Rebbeinu Shalom and admitting that, look, I'm not really worth anything anyway. I mean, I can't say that I was deserving of the tremendous chasodim that you gave me. So Yaakov said, Katointi mikol chasodim, that I really not have deserved all the chasodim that you've given me. That's the midah of Baishan. And why did Yaakov, we see it especially in Yaakov, because Yaakov was a pursuer of truth, which is a pursuer of what the true reality is. The hasoga of the yichud of the Rebbeinu Shalom, that the Rebbeinu Shalom is absolute in the universe, and that man in himself is really insignificant, and the whole idea of it is that man should adopt and do the will of the Rebbeinu Shalom, and that itself is what gives the chashivas to man. So therefore the midah of Baishanim comes from Yaakov. That's the first midah. The second midah, Rachmanim, compassionate, which means not to be cruel, not to be an aghzar, an individual who's cruel, a person who has no mercy on another individual. This comes from Yitzchak. And it's interesting, and Yitzchak, of course, personified the midah of Gvura. What is Gvura? Gvura is an individual who has tremendous strength, ego strength, to fight one's own desires. That's a Gibor. Like you see in Chazal, it says, Eizeh Gibor HaKoivishis Yitzray. Gvura, strength, means an individual who's able to control his impulses. The Yetzer Hara, HaKoivishis Yitzray, his inclination. So therefore that's what Gvura is. There's a tremendous strength in the individual to fight those impulses, to fight the Yetzer Hara. And therefore Yaakov, of course, Yitzchak, was very much into self-perfection, not to allow the Yetzer Hara in any form to interfere with his avodah. This was the major idea of Yitzchak. So, interestingly enough, that the Gevur of Yitzchak, which we will see later personifies really din, why do we assume that Yitzchak is the one who shows compassion and not Avram or Yaakov? There's an interesting Gemara in Shabbos that says that the Rebbeinu Shalom in the Osed Lavoi is going to go over to Avram Avinu and he's going to tell him, Bonecha chotu, your children have sinned. So Avram Avinu is going to say, well, then destroy them for your sanctification of your name. Akidu Shemecha. And if they did packet sins, then justice has to be done. So if they're worthy of destruction, so destroy them. It's interesting that Avram should actually say this. But anyway, without going into the deeper meanings of that Gemara, just understand it in terms of the three of us. Then the Rebbeinu Shalom says, well, let me take this to Yaakov. And he went to Yaakov and he said, Bonecha chotu, your children have sinned. So Yaakov said the same thing. Well, Yemochu, let them be blotted out, al kiddush shemecha, for the sanctification of your name. Here's what Yaakov said. So the Rebbeinu Shalom said, well, neither of these, of course, have defended Klal Yisrael. Let me go to Yitzchak. And the Rebbeinu Shalom went to Yitzchak, and the Rebbeinu Shalom said to Yitzchak, your children have sinned. So Yitzchak said, your children? My children, originally you called them your children. You said they were B'ni B'chiri, my son, my firstborn, in Mitzrayim. Now you call them my children? That's what Yitzchak said. And then he starts tining with the Rebbeinu Shalom, making a cheshbon, a reckoning. And he says, look, let's be realistic. How many years does a man live? He lives 70 years, right? So 20 years you can take right off, because before 20 you don't punish anyway for sins, so you can't punish Klal Yisrael. 25 years, so there's only left 50. 25 years you can throw away because a person sleeps for only close to half of his lifetime, so that you can throw away. So they obviously couldn't be doing sins then. There's only 25 years left, so I'll tell you what. So 12 and a half years of that 25 years you can disregard, because basically those are a person is engaged in his own needs, toilet needs, in prayer and eating food. I mean, half the life, a quarter of a lifetime goes away on just fulfilling basic needs. There's only 12 and a half years left. Okay, you take them all. You take 12 and a half years and you mechap on Klal Yisrael. And if you don't want to take them all, then I'll take half and you take half, and we'll both be mechap on Klal Yisrael. And if that doesn't work, I have to take all 12 and a half, then let the fact that I went to the Akedah, let that be atoned for the 12 and a half years left of a man's life that you say Klal Yisrael lived. So the Baruch Shem, of course, so what do we see there? We see that Avram and Yaakov didn't come up with Rachmanis, because Rachmanis means to suspend the judgment against Klal Yisrael. Instead, Yitzchak is the one who came up to defend Klal Yisrael. So you see that the meat of Rachmanim comes from Yitzchak. And the interesting idea is that what's the logical connection? Why is it a man who's goiv on his own Yetzer Hara? Why is he all of a sudden compassionate to the others? Because a man who's involved in gevura, in strength, in working on himself, knows what it means to fail. He knows how difficult it is to be goiv against the Yetzer Hara. And therefore, because since he's involved in this tremendous conflict his whole life, therefore he has an understanding what this conflict is all about, how difficult it is to win. And therefore, if somebody doesn't win, then he has compassionate, because he can identify with somebody who also went through that conflict and failed. So he can identify with that, because usually a person who's involved in gevura, which means that being kovish their own Yetzer Hara and so on, he can understand what it means to fail if others fail also. So therefore, the union of Rachmanim, compassion, of course, comes basically from Yitzchak. This we see from the interesting Gemara, of course, of Shabbos. One can talk in terms of what was the meaning of Avram and Yaakov, but I really want to just bring out the idea of Rachmanim and how this midah is really logically extends from the personality of an individual who's a gibor, who fights the Yetzer Hara, who is kovish Yitzray, and this is Yitzchak. The last trait of Klal Yisrael, of course, is Gimli Chasadim, which of course is Chesed, and that classically comes from Avram. Chesed Titin Chesed leAvram, Emes leYaakov and Chesed leAvram. And the idea of Chesed, of course, to Avram is because Avram personified kindness, and the fact that he was always trying to help somebody else. His Achnosis Orchan, as we see in Parshas Vayera and so on. Therefore, the midah of Gimli Chasadim, the tendency of the Jews to always be kind. Jews are always involved in social areas of helping, humanitarianism. Take a look at many hospitals. They're all the Jewish hospital of this, Beth Israel Hospital, Mount Sinai. All of these hospitals, Jewish hospitals of chronic diseases, whatever. These hospitals were started by Jews. Jews are very philanthropic by nature. But they extend the tremendous, they open up all kinds of gemach, minas chasadim, to lend money and so on. Jews are always engaged in philanthropic kind of pursuits. And this midah comes from, of course, Avram Avinu, who is, of course, a Baal Chesed par excellence. That's the inner of Gimli Chasadim. Unfortunately, Jews also have the same midah. Jews are very big liberals. They're very tolerant of other people, and they're very much in allowing other people to also to live and let live kind of policy. Liberalism comes from the idea of Gimli Chasadim, and as we know, Jews are very liberal-minded people, and therefore in the elections they always tend to vote that way. Jews are liberals, and sometimes civil rights movements and so on. Jews are always active in liberalism, liberal kinds of issues, and so on. And unfortunately, many times it backfires, because the very people that they do favors for and extend kindness, usually turn around and of course castigate and criticize the Jews for some absurd kind of thing. But the nature of the Jew to be liberal in political issues and to tolerate other people comes from the mid of Gimel Chasodim, because Jews have tremendous amount of kindness. There you see actually that the task that the Ov did, which is to personify the midas of the Rebbeinu Shalom, that third idea, which goes under the idea of to adhere to God's will, this is given over as a national trait to Klal Yisrael, as we see in the Gemara, that they have these three midas, these three attributes or traits, because the Avos left us three distinct basic traits. Now, we're now into the fourth midah. This ends the third idea, the third task, of course, which is to adopt and to adhere to the Rebbeinu Shalom's will, which subdivides itself into listening to the Taryag Mitzvahs and being Moser Nefesh for the Taryag Mitzvahs. And the second subdivision is, of course, to personify the attributes. We are now into the fourth task of the Avos. And the fourth task of the Avos is to produce the Tikkunim, to actually make sure that the universe is corrected. And you recall what that was, that the original state of the universe was deficient in the sense that the presence of the Rebbeinu Shalom was removed from the universe, and it was the task of man to bring the Rebbeinu Shalom back by recognizing that God is supreme. And then Adam Rishon contributed to the further removal of the Rebbeinu Shalom by doing the sin, this I had mentioned previously. So therefore, the task of the Avos is actually to masaken the Bria, whether it be the Chesan or the Kilkel, means whether it be the Hester, the concealment of God's presence, that comes as a result of man's contribution, which is Kilkel, or the Hester, which comes as a result of God's contribution, which is the original Chesan. In any case, the Avos had to actually produce the Tikkunim, which were not being produced for 2,000 years, since Adam. And where do we see the concept that produced the Tikkunim? Because in the Psikta de Rav Kahana, it says that when Adam, that in the beginning by Adam Rishon, the Shechina was b'tachtonim, that the Shechina was on earth, and only a very small amount was actually hidden. However, after the Chet of Adam Rishon, the Shechina went up the Maila, and after the Mabul and so on, the Shechina went up to the seventh heaven. There are 7 heavens, or 7 different levels of spirituality. In any case, that it went up to the 7th heaven. And there it was when Avram came along. As a result of Avram's Avodah, right, which we had mentioned, the Shechina went from the 7th to the 6th. As a result of Yitzchak, from the 6th to the 5th. As a result of Yaakov, from the 5th to the 4th. And then all the way down to Moshe, which I'll mention later, it went all the way down, and by the time Klal Yisrael got out of the Mitzrayim, was all the way down back on earth. Okay? What is the concept of the Shechina going from up till down? Isn't that the idea of removing the Hester? That's what it means. In other words, as the Shechina gets closer to earth, it means that is the Tikkun. Formerly the Shechina was away from earth, right? Or was driven away. Now it's being brought back slowly to the earth. And that's the concept that each of brought it back to each level of Shemayim. It descended each level. And that means, of course, is what's being said. That is the union of the Tikkun, which means the Ha'ora, means to bring the Rebbeinu Shalom back into the universe. And we see it as a progression with the Shechina, which is the presence of the Rebbeinu Shalom, as manifested in the creation. We see it being lowered closer and closer to earth. So therefore we see that the Avos were involved in actually bringing the Rebbeinu Shalom back into the Bria, where mankind would realize the true reality that the Rebbeinu Shalom, of course, is the Melech of the Bria. This is the idea of the Shechina coming down. Therefore, this is what the fourth task of the Avos, to actually do the Tikkunim, and as we see in the Medrash, the Psikta de Rav Kahana, we see it actually being accomplished by the Av. Now, this of course emanates from the metaphor of a Merkava. Remember the concept of Merkava, chariot, that the Avos of the chariot, in that metaphor is embodied the whole idea of what the Av is, and actually what Klal Yisrael is. Because each Jew is a Merkava, just like each Av is a Merkava. Because what are the results of the chariot when it finally brings the driver to his destination? That the driver is at his destination. That is the Tikkun. before the Rebbeinu Shalom was absent from the universe, right? And it's a job of the Ov and of all Klal Yisrael after that to bring God back into the universe. That's the job of a chariot, to bring the driver back to his destination. So therefore, if the chariot accomplishes its purpose, right, then what happens? The driver is now at his destination. So therefore, the idea of to produce tikkunim is really again embedded in the idea of Merkava, that the Rebbeinu Shalom is back into the Bria as a result of the work or the avodah of the Ovis. Now, notice that the Rebbeinu Shalom, the Shechina, is back again in the Tachtonim where it was previously absent. And that we see by the previous Medrash, that the Shechina was in effect brought down. In any case, this is how it's embedded in the idea of the Merkava. Now, what was each Ov's Chelek? I'm going through the different elements if you recall. What was each Chelek of the Ov toward that Tikkun? Well, if you recall that Avraham Avinu was a shirish of the Mashiach ben David, right, as I had said previously, and as such, he was involved basically in his Pashtus Kedusha to spread the religion or to spread the nature or the knowledge of the Rebbeinu Shalom throughout the world. That's what his task was, and that is the task of the Mashiach ben David, if you recall. His Pashtus Kedusha throughout. And that's what Avram was. The Mashiach ben David, the Shirish Mashiach ben David, which was involved, of course, in his Pashtus Kedusha. Yitzchak was Gevura, as I had said before. Therefore, his task, of course, was to fight the Yetzer Hara, and that's the idea of the Mashiach ben Yosef. Yitzchak is a Shirish the Mashiach ben Yosef, and the task of the Mashiach ben Yosef specifically is to subjugate the Sitra Achra, not to allow it to conquer, but to subjugate it under Kedusha. Therefore, Yitzchak was involved, of course, in Kivish, is Yitzray, to conquer the Yetzer Hara. And as such, of course, he was the Shirish of the Mashiach ben Yosef. Now, it's important to know that Yitzchak's job was internal, means it wasn't an external where he had to go into Golus. Means, this, which is the Sitra Achra outside. He had to go among Goyim, and he had to fight to remain a Jew even among Goyim. Yitzchak's main idea, because he lived in Eretz Yisrael, and he didn't go into Golus like Avram did when he was in Ur Kasdim, or Yaakov did when he went to Lovan in Mitzrayim. His main idea was Eze Gibor, what kind of Gvura, an internal Gvura, to fight the Yetzer Hara internally. This was what his job was, as the Mashiach ben Yosef. Now Yaakov was basically, ultimately Yaakov was both, that he encompassed both the Mashiach ben Yosef and the Mashiach ben David, and I'll get more into that when we talk about Yaakov, what that really means, because that can only be understood in the context of Yaakov and Esav. In any case, Yaakov was ultimately involved in both ideas. Now, we see Yaakov being involved in both ideas because in the beginning the Torah says he was Yeshiv Oholim, that he dwelt in tent, which means that his job was to learn Torah and to develop himself in terms of as much of a tzaddik as he can. This is the idea of Hispashtis Kedusha internally, means to spread Kedusha throughout the self, means to learn Torah, to try to do as much mitzvahs as possible in a very superlative way. So therefore, originally Yaakov Avinu was involved Yeshiv Oholim, which means to spread Kedusha. That's the internal spreading Kedusha. That's the inyan of Ben David. Later, when Yaakov went into Golus, he was involved in what? In subjugating the Sitra Achra externally. You see, subjugating the Yitzhar externally because he had to remain free, of course, of the influences of Lovan, and then later on, of course, Mitzrayim. But Be'ikar, he had to remain free of the influences of Lovan. Therefore, we see that Avram, who was a Shirish of Mashiach ben David, was involved in spreading the knowledge of God throughout the world, and that is the task of Mashiach ben David. But that's an external Hispashtis Kedusha. Yitzchak, who was the Shirish of Mashiach ben Yosef, was involved in Gvura, which means to fight the Yetzer Hara, but that's an internal kfiyah, means subjugation of the Yetzer Hara. And Yitzchak, of course, was Mashiach ben Yosef. Yaakov originally was the Inyan of Mashiach ben David, so therefore he was Yeshiva Yocholam, which means that he would spread Kedusha. However, that was an internal Hispashtus Kedusha, which was different than Avram's Hispashtus Kedusha, which means to spread it out to all mankind. Later on, as a result of Esav's failure, which we'll see later, he then, of course, assumed the Mashiach ben Yosef's task, and therefore he, of course, went into the Golus in terms of Lavan, and he fought the Yetzer Hara externally. It means he made sure that he wouldn't be influenced by Lavan's lifestyle, and in general by the people of Choran. So therefore, this is what each of's contribution to those tikkunim are. Now, the last element is what did they leave over to Klal Yisrael as a result? Essentially that what they left over, that all Jews are now involved basically in these two ideas. All Jews are masakin in the sense that they can all correct the deficiencies and the damages of creation. They can all deal with the concealment of the presence of the Baruch Shalom in the Bria, and that all Jews are able to correct those kind of deficiencies. Therefore, they can produce the necessary tikkunim or corrective measures. So therefore, all Jews are either from the Mashiach ben Yosef side or the Mashiach ben David side, in the sense that all Jews are always involved in those two kinds of directions. Either they're contending with the Yetzer Hara, the internal one and the external one, or they are contending with Hispashtus Kedusha to become righteous, either internal or also external. And this basically divides itself in three different kind of situations that Jews find themselves. Either they're fighting the Sitra Achra, which is the Yetzer Hara, and they're trying to remain at Tzaddik, or the Yidden are suffering at the hands of the Goyim, and they are trying to remain with the belief in God and also in the Taryag Mitzvahs. And the third situation is where the Jews are trying to proclaim to the knowledge of the Rebbeinu Shalom to all Jews and to all nations. So therefore, Klal Yisrael is involved in all those tikkunim also. We now see what the general structure of an Ov is. And if you want to go back into the Chumash, you'll see that all the different maisim and the incidents that happen with the Ovos are nothing more than reflections of these four different basic kinds of tasks. And this is what I really try to essentially give you. To summarize, in terms of what is the conceptual structure of an Ov, basically it boils down to three different ideas. The first idea is to procure the concept of a masakin. That's the first idea. That's what each Ov tried to do, to make sure that they would fulfill the task of why man was created in the first place, in order to reveal the Rebbeinu Shalom throughout the Bria. That's the whole tachlis why man was created. And the reward would be that to the extent that he revealed the Rebbeinu Shalom in the Bria, that is the exact amount of revelation that he would experience in Olam Haba, if you recall. So therefore, the first primary purpose of an Ov is to make sure that he is the one that can do these things. The second primary purpose of an Ov is to produce the tikkunim, to make sure that the universe does have the Rebbeinu Shalom back into it. And that is done by, as I mentioned, the two specific ways. One is to promote the Rebbeinu Shalom throughout the Bria, and the second, which means to perceive and to publicize this. And the second method or instrument that one does the tikkunim, of course, is by adopting and adhering to the Rebbeinu Shalom's will, which means Taryag Mitzvahs and also the Midas. Those two ideas, to promote the Rebbeinu Shalom and to adopt his will, those are the two mechanisms, the instruments by which the Ovos are masakin the Bria, and that's what they wanted to in the first place. And the third major idea in the Ov is that not only would they be involved in being masakin the Bria through these two tasks, but also they would be the shirish, the root for their descendants, that their descendants also would be involved in being masakin the Bria, until what's called the Tikkun HaKloli, the general state of the universe would be completely corrected, and that will be by the Moshe Mashiach. And you should know that every Jew has one aspect that he has to fix. Every Jew, his specific task is to masakin some aspect where God is hidden in the Bria. And I had once mentioned that quite a while back, exactly how that's manifested. But in any case, there you have it. The three fundamental ideas of an of is to procure that concept of tikkun masakin, to produce the tikkunim through the two ways of instruments, to promote the Rebbeinu Shalom and to adopt His will. And the third idea is to bequeath this, or to transfer this on to their descendants, that they should also be involved in these ideas, these tikkunim. And you should know that is the entire tachas of an of, in terms of what they themselves had to do, and in terms of the fact that they had to transmit this to the Klal Yisrael. And the reason why the Avos were always concerned with this, and that is the whole concept of an Av, is because the whole reason that why man was created was to do this task, to make sure that the Rebbeinu Shalom again is revealed in the Bria, and that is done by man's recognizing the Rebbeinu Shalom. And like I say before, and to the extent that man would recognize and testify to the unity of the Rebbeinu Shalom, to that extent would he be masig that unity or that experience of the Rebbeinu Shalom in Olam Haba, Midah Keneged Midah. This ends the idea of the general structure of the Av. It sounds a little theoretical, but it's very important to know, because if you understand this, you understand basically what an Av is and what the whole mission of Klal Yisrael is. Basically, it's summarized in just these three ideas. Now, where we see this illustrated, there is a famous statement that's brought down in the Midrash Tanchuma, and the Ramban mentions it. It's a very famous Ramban that's brought down in Lech Lecha, in Parashas Lech Lecha. It says in the Midrash that Kol ma shiur le'avos siman lebanim, everything that happens to the fathers, the patriarchs, to the Avos, is a siman that this will also happen to their descendants. In other words, to put it shortly, Maisa Avos siman lebanim, that which transpired with the Avos will occur to their descendants. This is a very famous maimah which Ramban brings down, and it's repeated many times in many different shurim. In other words, what does that mean? It means basically that the history of the Avos is a forerunner. It foreshadows the history of the descendants. That's what this simple statement means. Most people understand it on that level. However, once we understand that the Avos, one of the major tasks of the Avos is to be a forerunner of their descendants, that their descendants also should be involved in the same work as the Avos, right? Therefore, this then takes on a deeper meaning. It's the reverse. Not that the Maisa Avos are siman lebanim, but the Maisa Bonim is a siman le'Avos. Because since the idea is that if an Av does something, for instance, Avram Avinu, if Avram Avinu would adopt or personify the Midah of Chesed, what would happen would be is that his neshama would be distributed to all Klal Yisrael, and everybody would intuitively feel like doing Chesed. That's the idea. Therefore, if that is the case, if Avram has the power of being a shurish, means a root, and Yitzchak and Yaakov, whereby they can actually influence all neshamas of Klal Yisrael intuitively or internally. If that's the case, then whatever happens to the Jews must happen to the Avos, so that they can set the example and the pace, and therefore it can go back to their kids. You see the way it works? That whatever would happen to Klal Yisrael would happen to the Avos, that they can act as a shirish, that they can embed or make an impression, a lasting impression of their acts on their neshama, and this would enable Klal Yisrael later on would also go through those events to succeed in accomplishing the whatever task they had to do. You see, it works the reverse way. What does that mean? It means that we see that the future events of Klal Yisrael is purposely given to the Avos. that they should act in a certain way, and as a result of their acting that way, this would become embedded in their neshama, and that neshama which is distributed to Klal Yisrael, would then aid Klal Yisrael in withstanding the test situations which they have to withstand after the Ovos. See, that's a different way of looking at Maisa Ovos Siman Labonim. Everybody looks at the reverse, that Maisa Ovos Siman Labonim is that which happens to the Ov, happens to the children. And it's interesting and worthwhile to examine minutely the entire story of the Ovos, and that's why the Torah spends so much time bringing them out. Because if you look at it, you will see how each one is actually a reflection of what happens to Klal Yisrael through their 4,000 years of history. It's an interesting study in itself. What I'm saying is the reverse, is that the reason why the Ovos, what happened to the Ovos is a similar Bonim, is because since it had to happen to the Bonim, therefore the Ovos had to engage in those very situations and incidents in order that they should embed in their neshama the prerequisites which would enable Klal Yisrael thousands of years later to withstand the different nisyonos that they would go through. In other words, the principle of there being an Ov, this is the principle of the matter. The fact that the Ov was a shirish, that dictated that they would live future events. It's a topsy-turvy way of looking at it. And this is really the fundamental and profound way of understanding what that Medrash means and what the Ramban really means. And just very superficially, we can see how this really manifested itself in terms of what the Ovos went through, also went through Klal Yisrael. For instance, when the Ramban says when Avram Avinu went to Eretz Yisrael, his first stop was Shechem. And the idea of Shechem was that he should mispalel for what would happen later to Klal Yisrael by Yaakov, that Dinah would be abducted, and that Shimon and Levi would of course attempt to rescue her by killing out the whole city. So Avram came there, of course, to be mispal for what would happen in the future. So that's one kind of incident. Another incident is by Hebron, where Avram and Sarah were both promised that Maloch mimcha yitzeu, kings will arise from you, and David HaMelech began his kingdom in Hebron, the exact same place where the Melucha royalty was said that what happened to Klal Yisrael. That's of course where the Melucha happened. That's another example. Another example is that when Avram came to Eretz Yisrael, there was a great famine and he had to go to Egypt, and of course he hid the fact that Sarah was his wife because maybe they'd kill him and abduct Sarah. Therefore, that provided again a basis for Klal Yisrael, because if you recall, why did the Jews go to Egypt? Because of hunger. Yaakov and his sons went to Egypt because of hunger, because there was a row of birds, just like Avram. And while in Egypt, of course, what happened that the Egyptians had designs on the males and not on to kill them, in the sense that was the gzera that all males should die. Again, you see the idea that what happens to Avram happens to the Yidden. And just like Avram went in and went out untouched, the same thing Yidden went in Mitzrayim and went out untouched. See, again, you see the idea that whatever happens to the Ovos happens to the Klal Yisrael, because since they are a shirish, they must go through the future events in order to give the strength of Klal Yisrael to withstand the different ideas going on. And basically they do that in two ways. We have seen how the attributes of the Ovos, Chesed, Gvura, and Tiferes, and so on, in truth, how these themselves have actually been inherited in Klal Yisrael as national traits, because these traits enable the Jews to go through history doing the mitzvahs and withstanding the entire idea of Yetzer Hara and being Moser Nefesh, as I had mentioned, that they have azus and so on, stubbornness and so on. So therefore the Ovos gave or transmitted the inheritance of the national traits or characteristics. So in this way they were Maisa Ovos similar bottom. And the second idea is that the Ovos also went through the same incidents, the same kind of events that would also transpire to Klal Yisrael, to give Klal Yisrael the koyach to withstand what would in the future happen to them. This is the second idea of Ovos. And this is again the idea of mais over simin abonim. And what it really means is that simin abonim is really mais ovus, the reverse. A good way to understand it is like a mother or father, both of them, can pass on to their child resistances to the diseases, right? It doesn't mean that the child won't get sick. The child will get sick. But what it means is that the child has the antibodies to fight. It's able to resist the disease, not succumb, and also, therefore, to become healthy. The same idea that the others gave the resistances to Klal Yisrael not to succumb to the forces of the Yetzer Hara, to the forces of Yisurim, the forces of pogroms and persecutions and all the thousands of years that Jews had to go through. Therefore, not that the Jews won't be subjugated to this, but that they will be able to fight successfully, marshalling their own forces, because they also have Bechira. They have, even though somebody has antibodies resistant, he still has to do the right things. He has to eat properly, he has to sleep properly, he still has to do the correct things if he's going to win out with the disease, or he's going to allow the antibodies to fight the disease. The same thing. Jews still have to withstand the Nisyanus over the thousands of years. But since they have the antibodies, the characteristics of the Ovus, and the koichus that the Ovus gave them through their actions, therefore using their own bechira, they're able to fight and withstand and not succumb to the Yetzer Hara and to all the forces that would tend to destroy. That analogy is a good analogy in terms of the distinction between the Jews' bechira, because they have to have bechira too, but they have the resistances from the Ovus. So the combination of the resistance of the Ovus and their own fighting, maintaining a regimen to conquer the disease, is what eventually gets them out of the disease. I want to go into the idea of the structure of the chesed and so on, in terms of some of the spheres, which are very important to understand, and then we will go back into Yitzchak.